All right, folks, welcome to today's episode extra. It is my distinct pleasure to be joined by Karin Rinderknecht, who was good enough to stick around and chat with us a bit more after our exciting conversation about professional development. So welcome, Karin. Thank you for joining us. And, we introduced you at the beginning with your bio as the Senior Director of School Transformation for Literacy, which is a pretty badass title, I must say.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit jealous that you are in charge of school transformation. That's amazing. So tell us about your journey to becoming that incredible title. What brought you here to this place, Karin?
Yeah. So I have always been a reader. A lover of literacy. I grew up reading as a kid all the time. I was a lit major in college, but was not originally, didn't really have plans for education. Didn't really have plans in general, but education was not something that I thought a lot about as a career option. And after college, was in the Bay Area, was a web designer in the early aughts.
Right.
and found myself pretty unfulfilled with what I was doing. And I started volunteering at a continuation high school in the Mission District. And I think it was at that point where I was first exposed to the inequity in our education system. I'd grown up, I realized then, with a lot of privilege, particularly when it came to education in terms of what I had access to. And was volunteering in a classroom where students were getting a lot less than they deserved. And it was a group of students that our system had already kind of chewed up and really spit out. And being there, I recognized that there were a lot of problems with the way that we support and educate our kids in this country, and I felt that I needed to get involved and do something about it. I immediately signed up for the New York City Teaching Fellows program, where I moved to New York City and taught in a public high school there, and experienced a lot of challenge as a baby teacher with very little training or support.
Did you get like a full 2-month crash course over
I got
the
like
summer
6 weeks
Okay.
of support, so we could talk a lot about teacher preparation at some point also.
Yeah.
And from there, worked really hard to be a better teacher, taught in New York City and Los Angeles, and then transitioned out of the classroom to work in DC for several years for the Achievement Network, and really cut my teeth there in terms of actually supporting other educators. It was right when Common Core had rolled out, so did a lot of work trying to understand the new standards, try to understand what the implications for instruction were at the elementary and middle school level. And then when I moved back to Los Angeles, got involved with the partnership and was able to really focus on literacy instruction, which is sort of my love as a child, but then also my first experience in the classroom. And from that have learned a ton, working with amazing educators like yourself and our other colleagues and the schools we support. Learned a lot about early ed, which was very new to me. My background was at the secondary level, and yeah, the rest is history.
History, as
Yeah,
they say.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. That is fascinating. I don't think I realized you've made the jump across country twice.
Yeah.
Twice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
That's a lot. Having
3
done
big,
it once.
Right,
that is a lot.
yeah. And it's
Yes.
like working with like New York City, right, as a system,
Yeah.
Los Angeles, LA Unified, and then DC public schools. Also, it's been fascinating
Yeah.
to have a lens on how different places approach different aspects of education and education reform in particular.
Yeah. Well, so I'd love to go a little bit deeper around your sort of subject area expertise around literacy. And, you've spent many years now working with teachers, working with school leaders, working with schools, different districts around sort of improving the literacy of our students and the instruction we give around literacy. So, at the risk of asking sort of an obvious question, I'm curious to get your take on, like, why is literacy so important? Why are we pour so much of our energy into it? Why is that important?
I think it's important because we operate as a society where we rely heavily on the written word, right? Access to jobs, access to education, functioning in our world requires a pretty high level of literacy. If you look at just the test to get a driver's license, if you look at, for students, applications for financial aid, right? Like, we still operate for many good reasons, right, as a society where we're dependent on the written word, on being able to read it, respond to it, create it, produce it. And so if we aren't preparing students for a world that really relies heavily on being literate, being able to access information, evaluate information, disseminate information, then we aren't preparing them to function or thrive. I love books also, right? So there's a whole other world. Like, I would love to say, like, we want kids to, be able to go out and read and enjoy themselves. But I think it's really, it's a life or death situation for a lot of folks in terms of how our economy works and all the rest of it. And so if we aren't equipping our students with really strong literacy skills, I think we're setting them up for a lot of failure and challenge in life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates with me as someone who was a high school history teacher, and, sort of coming up in the space where there's a certain set of history teachers who, I think there's less of this nowadays, but kind of have had historically the orientation of, like, I teach history, and it's the English teacher's job to teach reading and writing, right? Like, they should just come to my class and employ those skills as we analyze the causes of World War I or whatever, right? What have you seen, I guess, over the years in terms of more people taking broader ownership over this really critical, important, sort of social justice-y aspect of what we're trying to get kids to learn, that is literacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps to potentially, like, redefine what we mean by literacy in some ways, right? It is reading and writing, but it's also operating within a particular discipline. So I think if you are looking to build more shared ownership, right, of literacy and increase attention to literacy across content areas, we have to invest people in understanding what is the literacy of their discipline and why is that important, right? I cannot be a scientist if I cannot read the instructions, right, for an experiment, if I cannot write up a lab report, if I can't communicate to others the findings of the experiment that I've done, right? I cannot be a historian if I can't engage with primary source documents, right? Like, history is there are things that happen, but what we know about history often is from what people have written about it, right, and their perspectives on it. And so if we can't support our students in accessing and engaging with that themselves, right, to come up with their own ideas, to think about, okay, well, what's next, right? Like, what are the problems of the past? How do we work to fight against those, right, moving forward? How do we evaluate the information that's around us in the world, right? Like, we are bombarded nowadays with information from all kinds of sources, and if we can't read them, right, and think critically about, like, what they're saying and how they're manipulating us potentially or not, right, then we aren't supporting our kids and navigating the world.
Yeah. Dealing with the era of fake news and alternative facts maybe brings into stark relief, the importance of being able to, like, have agency when you engage with the words of others, whether it's on, social media or a newspaper or the television. Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned a minute ago having, this love of reading books as a youngster, as a part of your experience. And I think at least from my perspective, you can feel free to challenge this if you disagree, but it has felt like one of the results of the kind of no Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, and now, every student succeeds. But this sort of modern era of education policy, that some of the just like joy factor, particularly in what we talk about and set up in school as students experience with reading, has maybe been lost, right? That just like the joy of reading a book and finding a story that you're interested in or that you can kind of get lost in and that sort of thing is maybe deprioritized in a way today. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on, like, do you agree with that? And if so, what do you see as the consequences of that change?
Yes. I do agree with it. I think if we think about NCLB and the testing culture that we're in, I think the focus of instruction has narrowed often. The target becomes the test, right, rather than beyond the test, all of the things we were talking about earlier. And I think that what has happened is the texts we're putting in front of kids and that we're engaging students with has also narrowed. And I think that we've taken out of spaces the kinds of opportunities that you're talking about, right? Where there's student choice in terms of choosing, well, what am I going to read and why, right? Like we're all maybe going to do a literary analysis of something, right? The outcome is the same, but I have some choice in thinking about what I'm going to read and why I'm going to read it. I don't think we are intentional enough right now in terms of thinking about the text that we're putting in front of students also, right? Like what does culturally diverse and relevant curriculum look like so that we can actually engage students in things that are meaningful to them, that matter, that might encourage them then to go read something else, right, that they're interested in learning about. And I think we often also, we think about it when kids are younger too, like what brings a child joy, right? Different kids may find joy in different kinds of texts, and so how do we create opportunities for students to explore interests through text? So that might not mean a novel for all kids. It might mean a sports encyclopedia or something very different, right? Something about volcanoes. Like what are they interested in, and how can we use text to develop those interests? I don't think that's part of our schooling right now.
Yeah.
I think instead we're very kind of linear in how we move towards a pretty rigid goal right now, which is unfortunate. So I think we need to figure out how to create space within curricula, within instruction for there to be both choice, right, and opportunities for students to explore things they're interested in. And then also there are times when it may be appropriate for all of us to read and engage in this together, so that we can have those kinds of conversations about what it's making us think or how an author constructed meaning in a particular way, or something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're making me think of a couple of things. One, that there was like probably a solid 4 or 5 year window of my life where at least the most frequent engagement I had with text, if not like by volume, the most engagement I had with text was like the sports page of the newspaper, and I like would go through, the Twins box score and read these articles about the Vikings or whatever. And I certainly read more of that than I read of any other type of text. I guess outside of what I was reading in class at school, maybe. But also remember like really enjoying that, right? And like, waiting for the news. I mean, this is ancient history now, waiting for the newspaper to come, kids.
Right.
What is that? This paper that showed up on your front step every morning. But just the feeling of excitement around, this kind of text that wasn't a mystery, but kind of, you were always curious, like what certain writers were going to say about what happened in the game last night or whatever, right? Or hearing about teams in other cities and what's happening to them, and you kind of like go on this journey. So one, you're making me think of that. Two, I've heard plenty of people say that along with this evolution has kind of gone by the wayside that the novel in school, and that, you know, kids are reading a lot more informational text than perhaps they did, you know, back in the day. And also just they're reading really dense, complex text, but short, you know, things that might be read in one class period or less than a class period, and not like a novel that you read over several weeks. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's in part due to how people are interpreting the standards in a lot of sense, and what the expectation of the standards are. And I think we have a pendulum that's swung potentially too far in one direction. So I think rightfully so was an emphasis placed on informational text and learning through text. And I think what a challenge you alluded to before is that often the English teacher is the one for whom reading and writing, right, the responsibility of reading and writing and literacy is placed on the shoulders of the English teacher, not taking into consideration that the majority of the informational text that we encounter in the world is actually not necessarily literary, right? It's often technical. It might be more appropriate in a social studies class or a science class. So I think there's a shared responsibility, right, across disciplines for students to engage in, again, the texts of those disciplines, which outside of an ELA class are going to be nonfiction, and that should really support a lot of your engagement with nonfiction, and that there should still be space in an ELA class, an English class, for engagement with novels, in addition to shorter excerpts, right? I think there's a balance. I think it depends on what are we getting out of this text, right? And I think with a novel is going to work in a very different way than an essay, right, or a memoir, a short memoir. And so thinking about what are we exposing students to, and what's the balance, and why, right? So why are we reading this novel, right? What are either the big ideas or the craft that the author has put into this novel to make meaning? Like, why are we doing it, and what are the learning goals from that text versus a short story or a shorter text? And if we don't do both, then we're missing out on some pretty major aspects of literature, right, and writing. And I think it can be challenging to teach a novel too. So I think that's
you don't say.
Yeah,
getting 30 people to all read a book who don't even necessarily want to, let alone your reading club that people voluntarily signed up for, and still don't read it.
And we don't have a lot of time, right? Yeah. And so, like, we can't read every page of a novel in class either, right? And so that becomes a challenge too. And so I think you see novels get taken out of a curriculum because it's challenging to take them on and figure out how to do it in a way that isn't just reading the whole thing to get through it, right? Because I would say that's not a reason to read a book, just to get through it. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is something about the sort of arc of the novel, I think, that's kind of maybe not unique, right? But there is something about the journey of it that is maybe distinct from other types of text, right? That it opens up possibilities for new things that can't happen as much in other kinds of text, right? Like characters can really develop over 400 pages in a way that it's harder without skipping lots of things in 20 pages. Yeah. Well, Karin, it's been a fascinating conversation. I think especially for lots of English teachers and folks who love reading in our audience, I can imagine hearing your perspective on on kind of how we approach the teaching of literacy is something that might be really helpful to folks. So thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And folks, we appreciate you coming on this little journey with us here. And as always, you can find all of our content on our website, which is aotashow.com. And if you enjoyed this conversation, then do us a favor. Share it with a friend, like, subscribe, all those little clicks, those little 5-star ratings. Help us out with the algorithms and help us get this conversation to an even broader audience. So thank you, and we'll see you next time. All right.
All right.
Can you pull up our YouTube page real quick and show her the thumbnail?